The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, under the current administration, has been pretty reminiscent of George Orwell's Newspeak. It's the opposite of its name, right? It's still called the Environmental Protection Agency, but its director, Scott Pruitt, has worked for years before he was EPA director to stop the EPA from protecting the environment by filing many, many lawsuits. And EPA policy under Scott Pruitt has moved in the complete opposite direction of actual transparency. And this is now sort of culminating with the EPA banning the Associated Press and CNN, as well as another environmentally focused news agency called E&E, from attending a national summit that they're running on contaminants in our drinking water. Now, contaminants in our drinking water, massive issue, right? We've got, of course, the Flint, Michigan situation, which is still not fully resolved, by the way. I mean, it's been years at this point that this has been going on. We're polluting our oceans in a devastatingly disastrous way. Contaminants in our drinking water, big, big deal. And EPA Director Scott Pruitt, truly one of the most dark and depraved players in the Trump administration, put this event together. And in explaining why CNN and the Associated Press aren't being allowed in, the EPA spokesman, Jahan Wilcox, says they weren't invited and that there was simply no room for them, which is just kind of weird, right? Because as we found out, when a reporter from the Associated Press showed up at this event, guards physically prevented him from going through security screening when he said, if I can't get in, I want to speak to someone from the EPA's Public Affairs Department. And security subsequently grabbed the guy by the shoulders and shoved him out of the building. And to say that this is nothing more than, oh, there simply wasn't room, that's obviously the safest thing for them to say. But it's still actually incredibly problematic because there's a court case called Cheryl v. Knight back from 1977, where a U.S. Court of Appeals ruled that an administration can't deny passes to the press, specifically saying that individual newsmen cannot be arbitrarily excluded from the sources of information. So the question is, was this arbitrary? If this is because the EPA and the Trump administration don't like CNN, which we know that they don't, or they don't like the Associated Press, that would be an example of arbitrary. If this is because there is literally not room for a single additional person in the room, I guess it's not arbitrary in that sense, but how do you really prove that there wasn't room, right? It seems very hard to imagine.
Yeah, I mean, if I was coming up with a list of outlets to invite because there was a limited amount of space,
yeah,
I feel like the Associated Press would be #1 on that list. Like, they have to be there because they're perhaps the most respected news agency out there.
Sure.
Maybe #2 would be Reuters, or #3 would be, I don't know, but CNN could be a little bit down the list. I just wonder if like Fox News and the Drudge Report and Breitbart got access, because that would be totally egregious.
You would think that the AP would be high on the list of who you would want there. The problem, though, is that the Associated Press recently broke a story about Donald Trump's dealing with crown princes and other fortune seekers from around the world, exposing the corruption of the Trump administration. And there's speculation that even though, yes, on the facts, the AP is actually considered one of the least biased and most accurate sort of reporting agencies in the United States, that the Trump administration and by extension the EPA are not pleased with the AP because of that. And we know that the Trump administration is at war with CNN, right? That one's not surprising whatsoever. So will we ever know the truth? Probably not, like with most things in this administration, but this is part of a trend that we're seeing. And we're also seeing the trend. We talked earlier in the week about regulatory capture, right? When you see agencies controlled by the people they're supposed to be regulating. In this case, we are also seeing the EPA more and more under the control of the polluters that they're supposed to be regulating. And these are efforts to silence press, keeping press out of events, the suggestion of expanding libel lawsuits, the government's idea of maybe ranking what are trustworthy and untrustworthy news outlets. Incredibly dangerous idea, as we spoke about yesterday with David Patrikarakos. Taking away journalism licenses. We don't even really know what those are, but Donald Trump talked about taking away journalism licenses or requiring journalism licenses. No matter whether they're clueless when they say it or not, this is a horribly authoritarian tendency, and this is one of the major meta issues, right? Press freedom, along with campaign finance, net neutrality, which relates to press freedom, as well as climate change. These are sort of the meta issues, and we are seeing a just decidedly and totally definitive. Oh boy, that's hope that doesn't pop up on Urban Dictionary anytime soon. A definitive move towards authoritarianism. I want to hear from you about this. What do you think is behind this decision? What do you think about this move that we're seeing? Very authoritarian move on media. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pacman Show. It's just the best program today. The Friday show will be taking calls, answering your questions, and so much more.
The David Pacman Show at davidpacman.com. The David Pacman Show at davidpacman.com.
Today's new member of the day is David Stemper. David, thank you. Really appreciate your support. Also want to say thanks to longtime member Norman Buckley, who's been with us since 2012. David, Norman, thank you both. Join them at joinpacman.com. We've got a great coupon code. It'll save you 40% off of membership. It's Vote Soon 18. You can also make a pledge of as little as $1 a month via Patreon at patreon.com/David Pacman Show. We're going to jump right into phone calls. A lot of people wanting to get on today at 617-830-4750. We are starting with the caller from 778 area code. You're on.
Hi, David. I just wanted to talk to you about guns and mental health today.
All right, go ahead.
So I talked to a veteran friend of mine, and he told me you can own a gun in Canada when you're 16 if you take safety courses, gun courses, pass their test, pass the mental health check, have 3 referrals, people close to you that are advocating that you're sane and responsible. You pass the background check. Mm-hmm. That's updated every day. If anything happens, you get your if you do anything that's serious and bad, you get your guns taken away. And your parents have to buy your guns for you until you're 18. So even when you're 16 and 17, your parents have to buy the gun for you.
Yep.
There was a story in Canada where a man was divorced. He owned guns, and I don't know who called exactly. It might be the government or a private entity that knew that he owned guns that called him and asked if he wasn't too upset or if he was psychologically okay, just to make sure that he doesn't do anything. Having said that, what are your thoughts on what I just said?
Well, listen, 16, 17, or 18, I don't really have any comment on that piece. In different parts of the U.S., different state law, you can have different types of firearms at different ages. I think that the licensing and the upkeep with the requirements is absolutely crucial. There's no reason that firearms in the United States should not be licensed as seriously as automobiles are. I think you should have to have a particular type of insurance if you own firearms. I think that the licensing requirements should be far stricter. Obviously, 100% background checks. Of course, the systems can't be a patchwork. Remember one of the shootings where someone actually wasn't supposed to have guns, but there was not the right reporting, I think from state to federal or something like that, and it slipped through the cracks. So I think that without question, there needs to be an infrastructure for licensing and insuring individuals who are going to have firearms. And I think that whether it's the exact model you mentioned or a version of it, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that one difference between Canada and the U.S. is that, like I said, our background check, I think it's it's updated every day. I'm not sure if that's what you guys have there, but if you do anything that's bad,
right,
that gets updated, we can actually take the guns away. And I think because of your Second Amendment rights, you guys sort of say, no, that can never sort of happen. Right?
No, there are situations where people have to give up their firearms, and very often they end up getting them back, and in fact was the case in a recent shooting. The problem here is, even if those records were updated daily, the patchwork between all the different states and federal, I assure you, means that even if they were kept on a day-to-day basis, they would not be updated on that same basis, and it's an absolute disaster, the system we have. Really appreciate the call. Very, very interesting. I think we absolutely need a system like that. Let's go next to our caller from the 916 area code. 916, you're on the air.
Hey, David, can you hear me?
Yeah, who's this?
Hey, this is Anthony out here in California. I was recently reading a New York Times, editorial or whatever, and they were kind of outlining the different paths that would happen after the Mueller investigation, if they don't find anything, it ends there, if, this, et cetera.
Right.
One of the paths that they said would end in a constitutional crisis where the Republicans just refuse to do anything at all, which actually kind of seems likely at this point based on their reaction to what's been happening.
Yeah.
Can you kind of outline what would happen in that scenario?
Well, you mean the logistics of it, or what the consequences would be?
Well, just more along the lines of, well, how would we actually get any kind of justice
We wouldn't.
if Mueller does go to Rod Rosenstein and says, hey, these are the charges, he, whatever collusion or whatever money laundering,
Right.
or, campaign finance, whatever it is, he broke the law,
Right.
and then the Republicans say, no, we're not going to do anything.
Unfortunately, probably nothing happens. That's why there's one very simple solution to this problem, and that's called voting 5.5 months from now. That's the solution, because your concern is exactly right. You are completely correct in asking this question, and it is, under most scenarios, extraordinarily likely that nothing will happen, even if, because remember, the FBI special prosecutor can't actually say that someone is guilty of a crime, right? They're investigating, and then they say, here's what we're going to be indicting for, and then you need a trial. And that, so no matter what it is that happens, it's not just up to those doing the investigation to say X person is guilty of a crime. It would be X person, we believe, committed this crime based on this evidence. Let's indict them and try them. And that's why there's only one path forward, Anthony, and that's voting in November so that Democrats take over the House and Senate. That's it. I wish there were more to it, but that's it.
Do you think that Mueller is holding off on ending the investigation until after the 2018 elections?
I have no reason to think that that Robert Mueller is making political considerations when it comes to the timing overall. I think the timing decisions he's making are, what's the order of who he interviews? What's the order of the indictments that he announces on the basis of who does he think might flip and assist and cooperate with future parts? Right now, I have no reason to think that he is deliberately slow playing this to see if Democrats take over the House and Senate. But it wouldn't be a crazy thing to consider if you were Robert Mueller, for sure, if you want to make sure that your work is not going to end up being thrown in the trash can effectively. Anthony, thank you for the call. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Let's go to our next caller. What about the 845 area code? Caller from 845, go ahead.
Hey, this is Mark Benjamin.
Go ahead, Mark. What's going on?
I'd like to continue with that statistics question I had long before, but I have a couple of others as well.
Well, let's stick. What's your best or most important question for today that you would like to ask?
Something on Jordan Peterson.
Okay.
Actually,
go ahead.
There's someone that makes his points just relatively better, in a much more clear fashion, and that doesn't have an overtone of bias. Jonathan Haidt or Haidt.
Yeah, Jonathan Haidt, I think maybe is how he says it.
Yeah, and he goes into group mentality and basically, like I said, just a more clean version of what Jordan Peterson does.
Okay.
Just at a better. better. And I'd like your thoughts on his view on liberals, conservatives, and libertarians, as he points out, are kind of different in not a special way, just in temperament. So I'm not talking about policy, I'm talking about temperament.
When you say he,
And,
are you talking about Jordan Peterson or Jonathan Haidt right now?
Jonathan Haidt. Sorry.
Okay, I don't know anything about
Haidt.
his views. Unfortunately, I don't know anything about his views on that, so I wouldn't be able to say.
How unfortunate.
Yeah.
Well, as for the statistics one, after you're done talking with me, I was earlier in the month. I asked, what's the best way to gather information to for self-taught learning online, because I don't really have the resources to go to college and do all the groundwork. And you pointed me out to a statistics book, and you were also about to say something. And then, of course, I hung up before then by accident.
Okay, I don't remember what I was about to say. What I can tell you is that at this point, between websites like Khan Academy, Class Central, I mean, there's just so many, Coursera. Just start doing free online classes in statistics if you're looking to learn statistics. There's a wealth of free resources, Mark, and I would definitely encourage you to check those out. 617-830-4750. Let's see who else wants to chat today. Let's try our next caller from 780. Go ahead, caller from 780.
Hi, my name is Tom. I'm just wondering why I've heard both you and Kyle Kulinski call Dr. Jordan Peterson a religious nut.
Uh-huh.
And I'm just wondering why the use of ad hominems, and I know I'm going to use a appeal to authority fallacy when I say he's highly educated. He has 30 years of experience in human identity. Mm-hmm. Is it because he doesn't fit into the, say, leftist narrative, or is it because he uses religious undertones in his philosophy that I see a lot of this being called religious nut and then dismissing his arguments based on that?
I have never dismissed a particular argument of his on the basis of his being a, quote, religious nut. But so, like, for example, right, when he said during a debate with Matt Dillahunty that even atheists who think they don't believe in God actually do deep down, is that an argument to you that seems like a verifiable argument in the realm of science, or does that seem like a completely undefeasible argument that is really of no particular use, that we would really only hear from someone who's a religious individual? You tell me.
Well, I'm not a religious individual myself. I find the both on the left and especially on the right, with the far right individuals using ad hominems to attack people, I just find that using religion or other means to say, I don't know, perhaps his argument is completely unreasonable. And
well, but hold on. Let's instead of making it this, so religious nut is not, I mean, I guess it is an ad hominem in a sense, but really what we're talking about here is someone whose ideas seem to be... Is everything okay there?
Yeah, no, you're good.
Oh, okay. It sounded like you were under attack for a second there. Listen, my point about Jordan Peterson is that the idea is that he is welcomed as this sort of hyper empiricist who is always working within the realms of what's demonstrated by data and so on and so forth. And then he makes the argument that even atheists actually are religious, so that we can't really say you can have a moral compass without religion, because even those who think they're not religious actually are religious. What are you going to do with that, right? How is that really a serious argument? So that's a comment about a specific argument, you know?
Yeah, that's the problem with him, is he takes a lot of cultural and religious norms and underpins his philosophy based on that. And I guess when talking to someone like Matt Dillahunty, of course, it would come off as super religious versus atheist.
Well, but aside from super religious, is the argument that there aren't really atheists because even if they don't know it, they actually believe in God? Is that an argument that is a useful argument in the sense that we can even measure that? Because the idea is even the atheists don't know that they're religious. Like that just it seems like woo to me. It doesn't seem useful in any way.
Yeah, true enough. I'll have to agree with you on that point.
Oh, all right.
I hadn't
Good.
realized on a interview with Matt Dillahunty where he actually said that. That's completely unreasonable.
All right, very good. Well, hey, listen, we ended up agreeing, which is a really, really great thing. Let's take a quick break. If you're holding on, we are taking more calls after the break, so please don't hang up because we will get to you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Let's go back to the phones. I know there are lots and lots of people holding. Why don't we go to our caller from the 585 area code? Caller from 585, you're on the air.
Hi, is this me?
That's you. Who's this?
Hi, this is James from Rochester, New York.
All right, go ahead, James.
I'm a big fan of your show.
Thank you.
Yes. All right, so I called to ask, in this day and age with this administration in place, it's hard for somebody who identifies as a Democrat or a progressive or a liberal, et cetera, whatever terminology somebody likes. It's hard for us to know what's the most important things for us to be focused on. And I'm asking that in the context of it's a given that voting is very important. But with this administration in place, it's hard to know, is there anything else that we should really be focused on besides just voting? For example, I don't get the impression that this is an administration that would be receptive to or responsive to getting emails or letters, et cetera, because it doesn't seem like there's the most basic structures really functioning in this administration. Systems, for example, the EPA. I hear about the EPA all the time,
right,
cutting down regulations. So now they're actually against environmental protection.
James, I don't mean to rush you, but what's your question today?
Well, I mean, with this administration, they don't seem functional. The government doesn't seem functional. And what do we really focus on besides voting? I don't think they'd be responsive to getting emails or letters, et cetera.
Yeah, you're right.
They don't seem like a functioning government altogether.
Right, yeah. So I would not waste my time writing letters to the White House. I would certainly not do that. I would vote, and then I would try to work on issues that don't depend on the Oval Office doing one thing or the other. You can work at the local level. You can work at the state level. You can work on issues like, I think ultimately the net neutrality, the overturning of the net neutrality repeal, I think ultimately will fail, but that's something where, you can lobby Congress. But yeah, I would not waste my time writing letters to the White House. That's not going to go anywhere.
Is there anything specific that you would really recommend, young progressives to be focused on right now besides just voting? Anything in particular?
I think the meta issues, right? So campaign finance, media ownership and net neutrality, an economic system that is more fair, I think, and climate change really are sort of like the four meta issues right now. If I wanted to say, I want to have like the highest level impact. So I would think about that, James. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the call. 617-830-4750. Let's try our caller from the 630 area code. 630, you are on the air.
Hi, my name is Gerardo. I'm from Chicago. Quick question. There was a monk debate on Friday between Michael Eric Dyson.
Yep.
I forgot the woman's name on the panel, and Jordan Peterson. I was curious as to, there was a certain part where Michael Eric Dyson called Jordan Peterson an angry white man. I was curious what you thought about that, specifically the fact that Michael Eric Dyson was defending political correctness,
right,
and used sort of like what some consider a politically incorrect insult towards Jordan, and Jordan ended up being insulted by it. Funny enough, he's defending political correctness. Seemed like kind of ironic. Just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, the entire thing was a mess, right? So like Michael Eric Dyson says that Jordan Peterson is an angry white guy. And then, so Michael Eric Dyson is arguing that political correctness is good because it prevents, I guess, offensive things from being said, or people are shamed if they said offensive things, or I don't want to mischaracterize his argument. But he said something which falls outside of what he's sort of saying should be the policy or the norm. Jordan Peterson, who says being offended isn't an argument, and part of existing in the world is that you need to be open to being offended, because sometimes good conversations take place when that happens. He seemed to be offended by being called an angry white guy. I mean, I watched pieces of the entire thing. I didn't watch the whole thing. I thought that it was a lot of people who like to hear themselves talk, and I'm not doing the false equivalency thing where I say both sides made good points and both sides went off the rails. It held my attention, and I was sort of curious about the feel of the thing. I didn't so much care about every argument made during the hour and a half or 2 hours or whatever. But quite frankly, I found that exchange was so silly because they both all of a sudden seemed to be doing what it was that they were arguing against, right? Michael Eric Dyson being, I guess you would say, politically incorrect, and then Jordan Peterson being insulted and offended by something, even though he says we shouldn't worry about political correctness. It's a toxic movement. So I didn't know what to make of it.
Yeah, right on. Yeah, I'm not a fan of either of those two guys. I just thought it was kind of hilarious that
it was very funny
where they did at that moment.
It was very funny. Yeah. Thank you for the call. I appreciate it. Yeah, if people haven't seen that and if it's your thing, I mean, check it out. I know that there's many people who enjoyed it greatly. Okay, let's see who's joining us from the 413 area code. A really good way to get on very quickly is to call from the 413 area code because that's our home area code from Western Massachusetts. Who's there from 413?
Hi, David. My name is Tom. I'm calling from Agawam.
Oh, all right. Go ahead, Tom. Agawam, by the way, if I may,
question.
Tom, before you jump right into that, Agawam has the zip code 01001. And unless I've been repeating this incorrectly for like 20 years, it is the first zip code. Because zip codes are two sections. It's the first two numbers and then the last three numbers. So Agawam is 01 and then 001. Is that right, Tom? Is that something you're aware of?
That is true. It's split. So I'm in 01003 or something.
Oh, God. If I had known that, I never would have picked up. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just have a question regarding the congressional race in my district right now.
Yep.
Richie Neal has been our congressman for a very long time. He's sort of a more conservative Democrat. And there's a progressive challenger, Tahira Amadul Wadood, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And she's very progressive, supports universal health care, the whole deal on that. But her opponents have been sort of smearing her because she is a Muslim, and she apparently was a chairperson on the Council on American-Islamic Relations,
right? Which
has apparently ties to Hamas and some other nefarious Muslim groups. Are you at all familiar with the Council on American-Islamic Relations?
Yes.
And is this something that I should be concerned about?
Oh, boy. I mean, listen, I know Richie Neal. He's been a guest on this program. I've not been following that race because I don't live there anymore, and there's only so many congressional races you can follow. I think Richie Neal he's not Joe Manchin, right? I mean, yeah, he's not the most progressive guy, but we don't want to say that he's just a sort of corporate Democratic shill. I don't know his opponent, but I would look very closely into CAIR, I think is how they say it, CAIR, the Council on American-Islamic Relations. I would look very closely. I would have some concerns about that, although I would want to know more about the candidate's specific history with the group. Like, yes, just because there is this connection to Hamas doesn't mean that this individual is someone we on principle shouldn't vote for. That's just something to look into, right?
All right, yeah. Thank you.
All right, very good. Appreciate the call. Good to hear from Western Mass. You never know, what we're going to hear from Western Mass. Let's go to our next caller from the 209 area code. 209, go ahead. .209, are you there? I hear dishes.
I was brushing my teeth.
Oh, brushing your teeth. Okay.
Okay. My question is, why do conservatives always bring up Venezuela as like a talking point?
Right.
Like, it doesn't really mean anything. What do you think it's so prevalent in their arguments against sort of socialism or democratic socialism
Yeah.
and social democracy?
I don't know, because it's convenient. Most people don't really know anything about it. I mean, you've got this. See, I actually think the left enables the right to use Venezuela in that way. And what I mean is that there's a contingent of the left, and I've talked about them before, and there's sort of this triad of opinions. And it's defense for the authoritarian regimes of Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro, sort of defense of Bashar al-Assad, skepticism of the Russia story beyond anything that you could imagine being reasonable, and a disdain and hatred for Israel, right? It's this sort of quad, this sort of these four positions. There's this contingent on the left. And I think that they actually enable the right to talk about Venezuela in a way that's more effective, because there is this contingent of the left that holds up Venezuela as some kind of true leftist paradise. And of course it's not. It's very, very far from that. So I think that the right does it because they get value out of it. And part of the value is created from there being a contingent on the left. I think I saw, I hope I'm not misspeaking, I think on the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King, which was recently, RT ran a piece in some way drawing a parallel between Martin Luther King and either Nicolas Maduro or Hugo Chavez, or it might have been one of those other South American TV networks. It was just crazy. And it's just that is what enables the right to then say, look at the disaster of Venezuela. Because if the left didn't defend that authoritarian perversion of so-called socialism, the right wouldn't get value out of saying, look at these people on the left who like what's going on in Venezuela when it's a disaster, right? If the left was like, no, that's a perversion of social democracy or whatever, I think the left would be much better off.
Another thing I want to ask was, so you're from Argentina, right?
That's correct.
So I was wondering if you were like going to do a news story on sort of the Argentinian economic situation right now.
Yeah, I mean, every once in a while I talk about Argentinian politics. It doesn't seem that interesting to most of our audience, but the economy is in major, major trouble, and it has been for a long time. That's why my family ended up in the United States. But I'll look into talking about Argentina more in the future. That's certainly something I would consider. I think we've got a little bit more time. Let's see who's on the phone from the 252 area code. 252, please jump right into your question.
Oh, hello.
Hi, we're not on speakerphone, are we?
Nope.
Good.
Oh, hello, David. This is Keon again. I just have to ask you this because I saw one of your one of the videos talking about you and your criticism of Sam Harris, and here's my question to you, because I didn't really understand it because I was kind of confused. You said that that Sam Harris was ahistorical because he didn't talk about the so-called Muslim golden age. But my question to you is, how's that relevant to today?
It's a fair question. I think you might have misunderstood my commentary. No, it's relevant to today only in understanding that what is taking place with Islam today is not something that has been the sort of norm among major religions for the history of those religions, right? There's no denying whatsoever, right? Like it's just math that right now the majority of terrorist incidents around the world are with perpetrators that are adherents to the Muslim religion. But I think it's relevant only in understanding that this is not a historical inevitability, and it's not been a historically persistent thing, that there were eras in history not that long ago where the violence was disproportionately coming from Christianity, and it's just a relevant thing to it's relevant in that it's part of the historical context, and that we should see what's taking place currently in Islam as a problem to be dealt with that is going on right now, but not a sort of systemic and historical problem that has pervaded all of humanity. That's the way in which it's relevant.
Okay. Yeah, because, like, I mean, I know, like, Christian history, Christians have been, like, very terrible. And most of that is due to, we in the West are more aware of Christian history than we are aware of many other histories.
I agree.
But I think that the my thing is, because I know you're not, because there's some people that think you're regressive.
Right.
I don't think you're regressive.
Thank you.
I know you really criticize Islam, which is good, because a lot of people, unfortunately, that call themselves progressive don't do that.
Right.
It's just that I just wanted you to clarify that for me, because I was like, oh no, David, no, like maybe I misunderstood. That's
well,
why
my pleasure. I'm glad I was able
people
to clarify, and I do want clarity this evening, and I do appreciate that. Thank you for the call. Great to hear from you again. Sorry we didn't get to everybody who's holding, but we will try again next week. Quick break, back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Let's get into audience questions for the week. First one. Hey, David, Thomas Jefferson suggested rewriting the Constitution every 20 years. Would this have been a good idea? I completely agree with the concept that the Constitution needs to be updated and that increasingly there are many elements of it that just do not reflect the realities of modern society. I am not a constitutional originalist. I've made that very, very clear. I think that it would be much better if there was a mechanism through which the Constitution could be updated beyond just an amendment to the Constitution. We've, of course, spoken about that, to reflect the realities of living in 2018 rather than in the late 18th century, for example. I think a full rewriting of the Constitution every 20 years in modern political circumstances would be an unmitigated and unfettered disaster, specifically because once you start to consider who is it that would do the rewriting and who is in power at the time that it would be rewritten. If you think the census gets political with everything that rides on the census, given that it takes place every 10 years and whoever's in power the year after that has a big say in how districts are redrawn in a lot of the country, just imagine what you would have if whoever's in power has significant influence over the every 20-year rewriting of the Constitution. So I absolutely think we need a mechanism to make the Constitution current and relevant, and I think it's increasingly out of date and irrelevant, but rewriting the thing every 20 years is very, very dangerous.
Yeah, I'd be very worried that our individual rights wouldn't be protected, like free speech and freedom of the press and all these things that we hold so dearly to ourselves. And also, even just going article by article, are we going to delegate the powers differently, or is Congress going to be in charge of one thing now, and the Supreme Court in charge of another thing, and the president in charge of another thing? Is all that going to shift around every 20 years?
Well,
we can't do that.
But it sounds like you're saying you're against the rewriting of it at all.
Yeah, no, I think we just need to strengthen the amendment process and make it easier, because we haven't seen in the 28th Amendment yet. Hasn't been an amendment to the Constitution in like 40 years, right? And part of that is because it's just so hard to do. You have to go through the Congress, you have to go through states, and it's just hard to get that bipartisan support nowadays.
So if I understand correctly, you're into fixing the shortcomings of the Constitution as originally written based on modern society, not by changing what was written, but by making amendments that either clarify, expand, or change particular parts of the Constitution rather than a rewriting.
I think 80% of it is okay. We were right to get rid of parts of it. Certainly that, black people are 3/5 of a person.
Right.
That had to go. Abolition of alcohol, that had to go. But I think there are processes laid out in the Constitution that will allow us to get to where we want as a society, and we can do it all within what we have right now.
It's very tough because once you put a timeline on it, like even any mass overhaul every 20 years, a lot of times you've got the same, you have court cases that can drag on for 6 years. Things could change dramatically when there's a rewriting that would fundamentally change the underpinnings of a particular court case that might be on year 5 or something. I mean, that's not a defense of not updating the Constitution, but the idea of a full rewriting every 20 years seems very problematic. I agree that we need a better and more effective system to really be able to make changes that are important. There's the idea of saying that you consider, so right now, Supreme Court, court precedent from the Supreme Court can be considered in conjunction or clarifying with regard to elements of the Constitution. Like Antonin Scalia has talked about, the Second Amendment is not absolute in every way, right? But it's still not considered a modifier of the Constitution. There's the idea that maybe Supreme Court decisions can actually become part of a sort of de facto Bill of Rights or modifications to the Constitution. That's very dangerous because it's political appointees that are on the Supreme Court. So I'd be scared about that as well. So I don't actually know, to answer the question, the right way to set this up. But a full rewriting every 20 years, for me, it's not the way forward.
Yeah, like if it happened right now, imagine who'd be on that committee. Mike Pence,
Disaster.
Chris Kobach, Ben Carson. We don't want that.
You could end up with Ted Nugent rewriting the Constitution of the United States if it's up to Trump. So incredibly dangerous. And of course, you could say, well, we would outline how the rewriters are selected, but that could also be changed, right? So we got to think about that. But I think the idea that the Constitution becomes outdated over time is very, very true. Next question. Hey, David, the Red Sox in your city of Boston just renamed Yawkey Way to Jersey Street to distance themselves from Tom Yawkey, who is a noted racist. What do you think about this and other renamings of Confederate leaders and other things? There's also the Yawkey Boston College building and the Yawkey Mass Ave Hospital in Boston. Yeah, so Yawkey Way, very, very famous place outside of Fenway Park, which was at one point not a pedestrian street. Now it's basically been turned into like a post-security. It's almost like a part of Fenway Park at this point. Like you can only get into certain parts of it with a ticket.
On game days.
On game days, of course. It was renamed because Tom Yawkey has a long history of racism, and it was decided here in Massachusetts that it's not good and we got to go. We got to get out of that. However, a lot of other stuff still has his name, although from what I've read, some of those things like the Yawkey Hospital is named after his wife. You know, you make the call. I don't know whether she was also racist, but it's the same name. I don't really know. So the question is, what do I think about the renamings? I am generally in favor of doing renaming when we seem to be glorifying movements or ideas that are discriminatory in nature, right? So when you have a school named after someone fighting against the North during the Civil War to preserve slavery, that's not where kids should be educated, right? So that one is very, very clearly on one side of the line. A football team being called the Washington Redskins, I think it's out of touch with modern society. I think it should be changed at this point. Yawkey Way, guy was a racist. I'm fine with it being changed. He was certainly a less notable racist than some of these others, although within Boston he was more well known. I'm okay with it, but I don't know that I'm out there picketing for that.
Yeah. I mean,
I don't know.
I'm a diehard Red Sox fan. I didn't even know about all this stuff until about a year ago.
Yeah.
Apparently the Red Sox were the last team to racially integrate, and they would, try black baseball players out at Fenway. And apparently Tom Yawkey yelled a racial slur at some of them, including Jackie Robinson. So I think you have to change the name.
Right. So I think now let's talk specifically about Boston and Yawkey Way. Boston, as a so-called very liberal Northeast city, has a big history of racism, a big history of segregation. The city is still significantly segregated by income and in many cases as well by race. There's an incredible amount of documentation of when the Celtics, who had a number of black players pretty early on, the basketball team, the Boston Celtics, horrible racism being hurled at them at the former Boston Garden. So I think that in Boston, we have an extra responsibility to go out of our way to make sure that we are not in any way leaving these relics of a retrograde past in Boston in place. So I'm for the renaming of Yawkey Way specifically, but I do think that there is a line at which we have to say, wait a second, hold on, are we going too far, right? So something named after someone who never did anything racist, but it was known that in private he called a bunch of Hispanic people something horrible, right? Like, where do we draw the line? We got to be reasonable people at some point. I don't know where the line is, and I think it's always a gray area.
There's a tough, slippery slope that you could go down because, say, Thomas Jefferson, he was against slavery in principle, but owned slaves.
Should there be anything named after him?
Right, yeah, because he's known for so many other things. And George Washington, he famously freed his slaves after he died, which I guess he's revered for, but I always thought of that as well. You freed the slaves once you no longer had a use for them.
Yeah.
So should we take out all relics and all mementos of George Washington? I would argue no, but coming up with a principle for that I think is really tough.
And this is why the people who are all about principles and say once you have the principles, you figured life out, I just disagree, right? Like, unless your principle is we don't ever rename anything, and then we could have things named after, Adolf Hitler or whatever. and it would be absolutely horrifying. And I don't know the answer, but I know that I'm in favor of institutions that have the opportunity to do renaming, to really examine it and consider what is the goal and what are the merits, and to make the decision that's best for them. Third question today. David, how would you feel about instituting required military service, but also giving people the option of doing some kind of organized national service instead of serving? You know, I would not be against mandatory service of some kind for everybody, regardless of economic background, regardless of all factors. My concern in the United States would be that we would screw it up big time, right? Because there are lots of places. I mean, look, say what you want about Israel's foreign policy. Israel has a mandatory service, which I think it used to be 3 years for men and 2 years for women. I think it might have been reduced to 2 years for men and a year and a half for women, where you do basic training. Everybody does it. You become trained in sort of military basics, et cetera. You can say very clearly, very early on, I'm sort of like a pacifist, or I object to really going in the direction of being trained for a military conflict because I wouldn't participate in it, period. And you can work in a hospital, you can work in social service, you can work in a lot of other areas, which I would argue almost, even aside from the military, what about just mandatory social service of some kind for people? Ideologically, I'm okay with it. In practice in the United States, I'd be really concerned that we screw it up and it leads to further militarization of the country, which is the absolute last thing that we need in the United States. And also, it is basically the reinstituting of a draft. So because of the history of the United States as having had a draft and then getting rid of the draft, even if you're creating something different now, where the idea is military service or some kind of national or social service, because of the history of the United States, I think it would be really problematic sort of emotionally for the country. So I think that I'm up for the idea of this being done in countries in general in some amorphous way. But I think there's no way to do it now in the United States and not have just a disastrous situation.
Yeah, I think I would be against mandatory service because it sounds like big government, and I don't necessarily want to force people who are like 18, 19 years old into doing something like this.
Oh my goodness.
But I think what would work is making something like joining the Peace Corps for a year, joining AmeriCorps, or getting involved in the military for 1 year or two, a prerequisite to get into college. So private and public universities across the country have this universally agreed upon system by which those who apply have to have spent 1 year or two in some sort of service. I think that makes a little bit more sense.
You said you don't like the big government idea of the government forcing you to do these things. Wouldn't the government have to force the private colleges to adopt the policy?
No.
So you're saying
college? No.
The public colleges could choose not to adopt it? Because that kind of defeats the purpose of your idea.
Yeah, a little bit. I would have to think that through a little bit. But maybe it's just like, you know, like you send in your grades from your high school and you have to meet a certain benchmark in order to get in. Yeah. And maybe you have to participate in some extracurriculars in order to get to an elite school or even a public college. This should be one of those things, I think.
Interesting. That might be an interesting way of implementing it. I think, though, that if you actually want it to be universal and not just public colleges, you've got to force the private ones to do it, which is not that different.
There could be some exceptions, I think.
Yeah.
We'll work through it together after the show.
We'll have to think about it. Yeah, after the show, we'll talk about it. Great questions this week. Send your questions in to me via Twitter. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman. We've got a great bonus show for you today, and we are off on Monday. Pat, don't come in on Monday. I've been telling Pat for weeks. He keeps talking about Monday's show, and I'm like, do not come in here because I won't be here for Memorial Day. But we will be back on Tuesday or today's bonus show, which is really, really great.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.